Welcome to Olympian Water Testing, giving you the best in water analysis. Today we're looking at the NIH website, and we're seeing how the heavy metal mercury affects people who have induced inflammation or autoimmunity. Now, what did they find, and what was the scope of this study? Well, human exposure to mercury leads to a variety of pathologies involving numerous organ systems, including the immune system, a paucity of epidemiological studies, and suitable diagnostic criteria. However, has hampered the collection of sufficient data to support a causation role for mercury in autoimmune diseases, and nevertheless, there is evidence that mercury exposure in humans is linked to markers of inflammation and autoimmunity. And knowing that this is a heavy metal and neurotoxin, that's very, very plausible, as even small amounts over time can cause this. And this is supported by experimental animal model studies, which convincingly demonstrate the biological plausibility of mercury as a factor in the pathogenesis of autoimmune disease. And in the review, they focus on the ability of mercury to elicit inflammatory and autoimmune responses in humans and experimental animal models. So, to give the major conclusions before we start, there are subtle differences, but the inflammatory and autoimmune responses elicited by mercury exposure in humans and experimental animal models show different similarities. They have pro-inflammatory cytokine expression, lymphoproliferation, and autoantibody production. And neuropathy are also common with these outcomes, and animal studies have revealed significant strain-dependent differences on inflammation and autoimmunity, suggesting genetic regulation. So, in short, it's a neurotoxin, and it can cause different types of inflammation and autoimmune issues. It also can exacerbate existing conditions. And while it's a distributed environmental and industrial xenobiotic, the consequences of the risk of mercury exposure for human populations is substantial, especially because it's in our water supply sometimes, in shellfish, in fish, and you don't even notice it. Just like other heavy metals, it's not something you can taste or smell or touch, so you don't know if your water is high in mercury. And occurs through diverse routes such as occupational, dietary contamination, overuse of therapeutic or cosmetic agents, fossil fuel, and exposure to all forms of mercury, including elemental, organic, and inorganic, can lead to a variety of pathologies involving numerous organ systems. And they focus on the immune system and the ability of mercury to elicit inflammatory and autoimmune responses. So, what did they find with the study in vitro? Mercury-induced proliferation of human lymphocytes have been reviewed, and these studies primarily involved the underfraction of PBMC, making identification of the responding cell types difficult. However, several observations are noted here simply because of their relevance to similar studies described below using experimental animals, and PBMC and thermocytes and proliferates within 6 days of exposure. And the removal of adherent cells does not affect the response of PBMC, the expression of several cytokines, including IL-6 and IL-8, but not IL-1B or TNF-A, are increased in PBMC. And intracellular tyrosine phosphate is increased in neutrophils and lymphocytes following exposure to mercury. So basically, cytokines are these different cells and these different reactions in your body. And what happens is, the more mercury is there, it's a neurotoxin that causes more inflammation. And also, you can see this among fish consumers in the Amazon, Brazil. The cytokine levels were increased with mercury exposure as well. And coming to fish consumers on Long Island, New York, they have found associations between mercury levels, serum cytokines, and they suggest there's a relationship between the exposure level and the increased cytokine expression. However, more studies are needed to take a look at that. And they also found similar conclusions in animal studies. And while this study has a lot of information, the main takeaway is this: that mercury can induce inflammation, it can induce autoimmune conditions, or it can make those conditions worse. So if you know someone who has these conditions, or if you want to avoid them, then it's always a good idea to periodically test your water for high levels of mercury.